Alrighty, folks, we are going to go ahead and get started with today's Flood After Fire webinar. I want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us. We have a very informative and very interesting webinar for you folks today. I'm going to go ahead and let everyone know that obviously we are on Zoom and everyone's accounts will be muted, but for the webinar, if you do have any questions while we are presenting, please go ahead and put them in the chat or question and answer box right there, and we will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar to address those. We have three amazing speakers today. We have Tracy, Peter, and Doug, and I will go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Tracy. Sorry, Tracy, you're on mute.
The little button, I got it. Good afternoon, I'm Tracy Harrison. I'm a mitigation specialist with FEMA here in Denver. I'm originally from Salt Lake, so just over the hill. Moved here a couple of years ago, but I specialize in flood after fire, education, and outreach. And thank you for joining us today.
Awesome, thanks so much, Tracy. And Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Reinhardt, and I work with Tracy in the floodplain management and insurance branch here in FEMA Region 8, focusing on flood after fire. I've been working in the floodplain management field for 15 years, both in the private sector, and today I'll be talking about protecting yourself and your property from the increased risk in flood after fire.
Awesome, thanks so much, Peter. And Doug.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. My name is Doug Mahan. I work for the Colorado Department of Natural Resources in the Colorado Water Conservation Board agency. I am the National Flood Insurance Program Community Assistance Coordinator for the state, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to let everyone know, we have sign language interpreters as well as closed captioning for this session, and we will be recording this session and it will be available afterwards. We will send out a thank you email to everyone who registered, where you will have the resources that we're going to share today, including a PDF of the slides as well as a link to access the recording. So no worries, just in case if you miss anything, we will capture it and share it. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Tracy.
Thanks, Sam. So let's get started. With wildfire comes an increased risk for flash flooding. We want to talk about that a little bit today. So next slide. So this presentation is going to touch on the change of flood risk due to a wildfire, how best to protect yourself, your family, and your property from the increased risk of flooding followed a wildfire, and the importance of having flood insurance. Next slide, thank you. So wildfires are a disaster that's been in the news a lot this past year, but the flooding after fire is something that isn't always on the minds of people living near burn scars, and it's often overlooked. Large-scale wildfires can dramatically alter the landscape and create conditions that can increase the risk for post-wildfire flooding, both downhill and bound slope of burn scars, particularly in areas that are not traditionally prone to flooding. So normally the vegetation absorbs rainfall and reduces runoff. However, wildfires leave the ground charred and unable to absorb the water. Thereby, they create conditions ideal for flash flooding. And these flooding events are generally more severe as it takes far less rain to produce a flash flood or mud flow on these burned areas. And it's important to understand that these flood risks, they remain in effect until the vegetation is restored and the watershed is stabilized. Next slide. So many people believe that because they're not located near a stream or a body of water, that they are not at risk for flooding. You do not have to live in a high flood zone risk to suffer flood damage. Around 20% of flood insurance claims occur in moderate to low risk areas. So with the significant change to the landscape due to the wildfire, these burn scar areas are highly susceptible to flash flooding from just minor rainstorms and are known to roll boulders, tear out trees, and destroy buildings and bridges. It's sometimes difficult for people to visualize what a mud flow is, but mud flows are rivers of flowing mud on the surface of normally dry land, and they're often caused by a combination of vegetation loss and heavy rains. So we're going to show you a video of some mud flows. So mud flows have been described as having a consistency of a milkshake. Mud flows differ from other earth movements where there's not a flowing characteristic, such as like a mudslide, slope failure, or a landslide. Mudslides are debris flows of rock and mud and dirt that's thicker than a mud flow. So mudslides have been compared to having the consistency of cake. But both flash flooding and mud flows are covered by the NFIP flood insurance policies, whereas landslides and mudslides are not covered under the NFIP. So I'm going to turn the time over to Peter Reinhardt so we can go on to our next section.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate it. So after and even prior to a wildfire being fully contained, there's going to be an increased risk to flooding both downslope and downstream of the burn scar. And the time to start preparing and protecting is now. Next slide, please. People need to know about the increased risk of flooding following the wildfire. The U.S. Forest Service, along with the U.S. Geological Survey, collected data from both the East Troublesome as well as the Cameron Peak fires that occurred last year. And that data was used to compile what's called a Burn Area Emergency Response Report, or what's generally referred to as a BEAR report. Now, these reports can show the potential likelihood of flooding and debris flows based on specific design rainfall events. If you're interested, the reports for both the East Troublesome and Cameron Peak wildfires can be viewed online, or your local county emergency manager may also have the reports available in their office for people to review. And just to be aware, BEAR reports aren't completed for every wildfire. So a general rule of thumb for people to understand is that if you can look up slope and see the burned area from where you are, then you're at risk for flooding. Now, you're not going to have time to start gathering things when a natural disaster is fast approaching. So an important step in protecting yourself and your family is to put together what's referred to as a to-go kit long before a wildfire or disaster occurs, and keep it easily accessible so you can take it with you when you have to evacuate quickly. Each person in a household should have a readily accessible to-go kit with their specific needs. And backpacks work great for storing items and are quick to grab. And you need to plan to be away from your home for an extended period of time. So make sure you have everything you need, such as important documents and medicines. Evacuation routes. People need to have an evacuation plan in place and make sure that all family members are familiar with it. And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have time to evacuate from an imminent threat of flooding and need a shelter in place, you should go to an elevated floor and take your to-go kit with you. With the increased risk of flooding after a wildfire, you need to stay informed, and there are a number of ways to do that. Attend local emergency management community meetings. Be aware of threatening weather and sign up for local emergency weather alerts, either through the National Weather Service, or contact your local emergency manager to find out if they have a specific alert service for your area. Next slide, please. We can't reiterate enough that people need to understand the increased risk of flooding in these burn scar areas and the importance of protecting yourself and your family. But you also need to think about protecting your investments, including your house. The time to review your insurance policies for your home is now, not after the home has been flooded. Many people assume that because they have a homeowners or renters insurance policy that they're protected from flooding. However, generally homeowners policies don't cover flood damage. The best way for people to protect themselves financially from post-wildfire flooding is to purchase flood insurance. Along with purchasing a flood insurance policy, take an inventory of your personal property within your home by documenting items in videos or pictures, and be sure to move more valuable or irreplaceable items to the highest floors. And if you can, prepare your home ahead of time for potential flooding. Some things you can do include anchoring fuel tanks, installing sump pumps with backup power, and install drain plugs and backflow valves to prevent floodwaters from entering drains and into your house. And next, Doug Mahan with CWCB will talk about flood insurance basics. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Again, I'm Doug Mahan. I'm with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and I'll be covering flood insurance basics during this webinar. So wherever it can rain, you can have a flood. And we know from experience that just 1 inch of water in your home can cause up to $25,000 of flood damage. As Peter mentioned, you want to protect the life that you've built. The fastest way to recover from a flood event, physically and financially, is to have flood insurance. The time is now to contact your insurance agents if you happen to live in an area that is at risk for flooding or it has become at risk for flooding because of a wildfire. Next slide, please. When people think about determining whether or not they are at risk from flooding, they often turn to a flood insurance rate maps. These maps are produced by FEMA, and they depict the different risks of flooding based on a 1% annual chance of flood. Now, the 1% annual chance of flood is often referred to as the 100-year flood. This is somewhat of a misnomer because the flood can happen multiple times in a 100-year period. Typically, the areas of flooding after fire will consist of overland flows from the burn scar and will not be depicted on a FEMA flood insurance rate map. These are temporary conditions of increased risk due to the wildfire, and FEMA does not map these temporary conditions. Because flood maps are not updated to show potential risk due to the burn scars, a good rule of thumb, as Peter mentioned, is that if you can look upslope and see the burned area from where you are, then you are at risk for flooding. NFIP flood insurance is available to all residents in communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. It's not just for those that have have property in an identified regulatory flood hazard area. And as Tracy mentioned, between 20% and 30% of all flood insurance claims are for structures outside of the mapped regulatory flood hazard areas. Unlike private flood insurance, National Flood Insurance Program policies cannot be canceled by the insurance carrier. Next slide, please. There are some key differences between homeowners and flood insurance policies. Homeowners insurance covers both personal property and the dwelling under one policy with one deductible. Flood insurance generally covers the dwelling and does not include personal property contents. However, the National Flood Insurance Program policy gives the property owner the option of including contents for personal property as a separate coverage with 2 deductibles. Replacement cost is available for primary single-family homes with the policy building coverage limits equal to 80% or more of the full replacement cost of the home. NFIP flood policy personal property and other occupancies are paid on an actual cash, valueless, depreciated cost. Under some homeowners policies, foundation coverage may be excluded. Under the NFIP, building coverage pays for permanent items such as plumbing and electrical systems, HVAC systems, water heaters, refrigerators, stoves, built-in dishwashers, permanently installed paneling, wallboard, bookcases and cabinets, and debris removal. Some items that are often located in basements, such as a furnace, hot water heater, and circuit breaker, are also covered. Other items may be in a basement, may not be covered. It is important to read your policy for any exclusions. As most homeowners policy exclude flooding and mud flows, the NFIP policy is designed as insurance policy to cover this gap in homeowners. and it does cover flooding and mud flows. We'll go to the next slide, please. There are coverages on your standard homeowners policy that are specifically excluded in an NFIP flood policy. Examples of some exclusions include property outside a building, such as swimming pools, hot tubs, decks, patios, fences, and walkways, as well as septic tanks. Landscaping, driveways, sidewalks, retaining walls are also not covered. Excluded are payments for living expenses, such as temporary housing and financial losses caused by business interruption or the loss of an insured property. Damage that could have been avoided. This includes moisture, mildew, or mold resulting from either pre-existing conditions or from a lack of timely remediation are also excluded. Please read your policy so that you know what is and is not covered. It should be noted that there is a 30-day waiting period from the date of purchase to the time an NFIP flood policy becomes effective. You may have heard of a wildfire exception to this rule. This rule states that if a property is impacted by flooding on burned federal land and the insurance was purchased within 60 days of the wildfire containment date, then the 30-day waiting period may be accepted. As the East Troublesome fire was contained on November 30th and the Cameron Peak fire on December 2nd, we are well past the 60-day mark for this exception to be relevant. Any exception are based and assessed at the time of the claim and are not automatic. For those of you that may be at risk and do not yet have flood insurance, again, now is the time to talk to your insurance agent. The NFIP flood policies do come with coverage limits. Congress limits the amount of coverage in an NFIP policy depending on the occupancy of the building, and there are different levels of maximum coverage for both building and contents. There are also a separate deductible for building and contents. The higher the deductible, the lower your premium. Homeowners and commercial property owners should generally elect to secure both building and contents coverage, while renters elect to only purchase contents coverage. As the slide shows, a residential building with 1 or 4 units can be insured up to $250,000. The contents of each unit can be insured up to $100,000. 5 or more, the building in a residential building can be insured up to $500,000, and again with contents at $100,000. A non-residential building can be insured up to $500,000 with contents insured up to $500,000. And condominium buildings, they can be insured up to $250,000 per unit with the contents per unit at $100,000. Private flood insurance may be available. If the NFIP maximum limits are not adequate for your property, private flood insurance may be an option. When shopping for flood insurance, remember that many policies also have limited individual limits on items within a specific category. Next slide, please. Flood insurance coverage is not only available for existing structures, but is also available for buildings under the course of construction and prior to being walled and roofed. In order to be eligible for insurance coverage during construction, the work must remain in progress. If construction does stop at any time, it may be for a period not to exceed 90 continuous days thereafter for the policy to remain in effect. In addition, materials and supplies that are being used for the construction will only be covered by the policy while these items are stored in a fully enclosed building at the insured location or on an adjacent property. Special consideration for insurance coverage while under construction is that at the time of loss, the deductible amount will be 2 times the deductible that would otherwise apply to a completed building. For more information on building under the course of construction, we suggest you review the NFIP flood insurance coverage policy or contact your local insurance company or agent. Remember, prior to starting any construction, it is important to consult your local building department and floodplain administrator to ensure that you follow all local, state, and federal regulations. At this time, I'll hand it back to Sam, and he'll take you through the rest of the webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Doug. All right, we have a couple of questions already lined up. Let's see, Lisa asks, and just to let everyone know, you can put a question in the question and answer box or in the comments, or sorry, the chat box, and we will get to it. We have plenty of time for question and answers right now. So these will be answered by one of our panelists. And the first question is, how do you know when it's not safe to evacuate and need to shelter in place? I don't know if either maybe Tracy or Peter wants to take that, depending on their expertise.
This is Peter, I can take that. So in general, hopefully you'll have enough time to evacuate. And again, as we mentioned, listen to weather reports, sign up for emergency alerts. But again, if you're leaving to evacuate and you don't have time to get out because the water's coming in and roads are blocked because of floodwaters, we don't want people to drive through water. Generally 6 inches of water can lift a vehicle and cause them to lose control. So in times of that, we want people to stay safe. So again, if you don't have time to evacuate, then shelter in place. And again, make sure you have everything you need to stay safe and protect yourself for the time being, and reach out to people to let them know where you are and that you are trapped by floodwaters. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Peter. Our next question comes from John, and it looks like this one might be a little specific, but John asks, when will the new flood maps be available that reflect the NFIP new rating plan effective October 1st, 2021? Doug, I don't know if you have an indication on that.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, John, for your question. I believe what you're referring to is Risk Rating 2.0, which is being rolled out on the 1st of October of this year. The maps themselves won't change. What will change is how risk is assessed on individual structures. There are several criteria that will be assessed. It's no longer you're in a certain flood zone, such as zone A or zone AE or zone X. Therefore, your flood insurance premium will be this amount for this area. Now they will be assessed on an individual basis, each structure, depending on how close they are to a flooding source. If mitigation, flood mitigation has been completed on a structure if necessary. So again, new maps won't be issued, just individual assessments on structures that are required to have insurance will be changed to include individual characteristics of that structure and where it's located. John, does that answer your question? I hope it does.
Thanks so much, Doug. Another quick question from John, which is a great question for this webinar, is what are the current estimates of time frame for increased flood risk following a wildfire?
I'll take a stab at that as well. Tracy, please jump in. Nope, turn your camera back on. So the risk of flooding after wildfire is between 3 and 5 years after the fire happens. So those of you that have been impacted by the wildfire, those of you that live in a community that has had a wildfire nearby, you can expect an increased flood risk for the next 3 to 5 years. Tracy, please jump in.
That's correct, Doug. There's a lot of factors that can go into when vegetation is restored. So depending on the slope angle, what side it's facing, it could take a while for the vegetation to be restored. So until that vegetation is restored and the watershed is stabilized, you're still at a risk. So it could be maybe 7 years, 10 years, just really depending on how well that vegetation gets reestablished.
Thanks so much, Doug and Tracy. Another quick question we have from Lisa again. Is it up to individual property owners to do flood mitigation such as straw bales and reseeding, or is it up to municipalities since the volume of water is so big and would threaten infrastructure like bridges?
That's a good question. I'll try and tackle that, Lisa. First of all, there's a lot of components that obviously go into restoration of watersheds and where a wildfire burn has happened. And there are different factors of who owns the property. Is it private? Is it federal? Is it state? So ownership has something to do with that also. If you're wondering what your community is doing, you could get in contact with your local emergency manager for the county. They should be able to let you know that there are mitigation plans in place right now to help with reseeding, to help with maybe enlarging culverts. That's all part of the rebuilding process. It is a little outside Peter and myself's and Doug's wheelhouse because we generally deal with specific education and outreach. But I think if you get in contact with your local emergency manager, they can let you know that there are projects that are in the works, whether it's for individual homeowners, whether it's for the county, or whether it's for the federal, to help restore that watershed.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And I think you're going to want to stay on for this next one. Glenn asks, could you please expand on the difference between mud flow and mudslides? The descriptions used, for example, milkshake versus cake, seem a bit subjective. Who would make the determination? After fires, it seems both scenarios have higher potential. Thanks.
Good, excellent question. Who makes that overall determination? That's going to be the claims adjusters. They're the ones that are going to go out and determine if a claim is covered. The majority of things that we're going to see in these situations for wildfire to start with is going to be type of a debris flow. It's going to be intense rainfalls on that burn scar that's going to be moving ash and debris downstream and downslope. If it's flowing, as I think the picture with the car, and you could see the car was moving due to water, that's going to be the flowing characteristics that's going to make it a mud flow. If it is a landslide or a mud flow, that's where the ground gets so saturated with water that it's unable to stay attached to, let's say, a slope, and it will slough off and it will just kind of crumble and fall down the mountains or the slope. That's going to be more your mudslide and would not be covered, or landslide, and would not be covered on an NFIP policy. So I hope that helps a little bit on the clarification. It's really the liquid movement of the mud, and it can have boulders in it, but they're being moved by liquid mud. So it's that liquid consistency that's making it more of a mud flow.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Couple other questions here from Katie, and this is an NFIP question. Grant County is in the process of adopting the NFIP, but it sounds like it won't be completed until the end of April, with the 30-day lag by insurance companies for insurance. Would you recommend property owners wait for the NFIP or seek private insurance?
Thank you, Katie, for the question. It's a great question, and I am very happy and pleased that Grant County has decided to join the NFIP. Like you said, it's still a work in progress. They haven't finalized their flood insurance regulations. I know it's going before the county commissioners later this month. We hope to have all of the paperwork into FEMA soon, so they can be a fully participating member of the NFIP. Do we recommend you seek out private insurance in the time between now and when NFIP insurance is available? Yes, I think it's smart to begin looking at insurance options. What you may find is private insurance is expensive. That may be a deterrent, but it doesn't hurt to look, and starting earlier rather than later is something that I would definitely recommend. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Doug. All right, we've got a couple more questions coming in. These are great. Denise asks, is there any additional help available for evacuating disabled persons during an emergency?
I can take a stab at that for Denise. There are ways that a community will put together a type of registration for those that might need an additional assistance when evacuating. So while I'm not part of that, I would recommend contacting your local emergency manager if you're in Graham County or if you're in Larimer County, and then finding out where you would get set up for that registration. I do know that most counties will have a registration for people that need assistance when evacuations happen. So I'd recommend reaching out to them.
Thanks so much, Tracy. This next one from Tina is not really a question, more of a comment, but great information from Tina. Tina says, I'm helping with a volunteer wildfire mitigation project at one of my summer camps in Empire, Colorado, to help reduce the risk of wildfires next month. I am going to help plant new flowers and trees to help reduce the risk of wildfire. I'm helping make the camp safer this summer, and my sister is interested in water hydrology. Thanks so much for sharing, Tina. We're always glad to see folks interested in this topic and taking action in their own communities. So great to hear from you.
I'd like to jump in on Tina's comment.
Sure.
Tina, thank you very much for volunteering, and it's really important work that you're doing. I'll mention that the state legislature has released funds, grant funding, to the Colorado Water Conservation Board to help with wildfire and flood mitigation. This is part of our watershed protection program. So if you or you know an organization that is interested in a flood or fire mitigation project, I encourage you to go to the Colorado Water Conservation Board website and check out our grants that are available for those types of projects.
Thanks so much, Doug. It looks like Lisa has a comment. She says she's in El Paso County and says, our county does not maintain a registry. I don't know if anyone, either Doug, Tracy, or Peter, had a clarification or comment on El Paso County.
Lisa, are you in the unincorporated area of El Paso County or in a incorporated community? Because the community itself may have a registry to help those that are disabled evacuate.
And we can always follow up with individual questions afterwards. So if you do want a specific follow-up, feel free to type your information to one of our panelists or just our panelists in the chat, and we will be able to follow up with you after this. We want to make sure that everyone has access to the information and the answers that we're able to provide.
Sam, if I could jump in here.
Sure.
I get a common question, Peter and myself, and probably Doug while we're out. A lot of people will go to their insurance agent and ask for flood insurance, and their insurance agent might tell them they're not eligible for flood insurance, or they can't get flood insurance. So I want to clarify that there are ways of getting flood insurance, if not through the NFIP, through the public from private market. Because some areas like Grand County right now are in the process of participating. You do not have to be in a special flood hazard area to get flood insurance. That's a common misconception. So I want to make sure that people are aware of that. If you have further questions, if an insurance agent is telling you you cannot get flood insurance, later on in the presentation, we're going to have some links that you can actually click on to get insurance agents in the area that can assist you if your agent is not able to provide that.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And you might want to stay on because we have another question about mud flows and mudslides. Peter asks, does the American Red Cross differentiate between mud flows and mudslides in providing assistance?
It's a good question, Peter. I do not have an answer for that. Might be able to find out. Doug, do you have an answer on something that the Red Cross would do?
I don't know that the Red Cross differentiates between disasters. If you're a victim of a disaster, I think the services that they provide would be available, regardless of what type of disaster it would be. Again, I don't have any details. That's just my experience with them.
Thanks so much. We have a couple more questions coming in. This one is from Rick. And Rick says, did I understand you correctly that in addition to destroying the surface vegetation, a wildfire also adversely impacts the soil's ability to absorb moisture?
That is very correct, Rick, excuse me. It does. It forms a crusty layer on top of the soil, and that crusty layer acts as a barrier. So it will speed up the flow of water over the surface instead of letting it absorb. And the bear reports that Peter mentioned earlier have a visual representation of areas where the fire burned hotter, more severe, which impacted the soils, as opposed to some areas where the fire burned a little bit less severe and would not have a bad soil impact. The ones that have the orange colors and the red colors are going to have a higher burn severity, and they are going to have a deeper soil compromised. So those bear reports, if you take a look at the map and where you are at, it can help you gauge what areas might have a higher fire burn, and that way it would also let you know those areas have more compromised soil conditions. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Let's see, we have a couple more from, let's see, Tina, which Tina did indicate she's a volunteer for the American Red Cross Mile High chapter. And she says we have 2 summer camps that are for people with disabilities in Woodland Park and Empire. How would campers and camp counselors be evacuated?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't have a specific answer. I would work closely with your local community's emergency response teams to ensure that they are aware of the needs of your campers and your volunteers. Again, I don't believe the state would have any regulations regarding on how a campsite would be evacuated, especially one with disabilities. So I think this is a question that is best presented to the organizations that run the campsite and to your local communities that are responsible for the emergency response to a disaster. Tracy, would you agree with that? I don't know that FEMA would be involved.
No, FEMA would not. Obviously, we're kind of the financial recovery side of it, or financial reimbursement for response. But I would say, yes, work closely with your local emergency managers. Check out and see if there is a registration list that they have. And they could talk you through how they're planning. There should be some evacuation plans that they already have in place, and they could maybe share that plan with you.
Thank you, Tracy.
This next question is about mitigation and the differences between those. So Smida, I hope I said that correctly. Our neighborhood is also actively working on wildfire mitigation in our community. Do wildfire mitigation and flooding mitigation actions complement each other? My concern is that we're removing trees and vegetation for the fire mitigation, which seems to run counter to mitigating for flood risk.
Yeah, that's a great question. We all are connected. It is connected, very much so. So wildfire mitigation is so important because we're wanting to prevent the wildfires in the first place, or at least mitigate them. If we can do that and we can mitigate the wildfires, then we probably are not going to end up having that flood after fire risk. In the cases like this, where maybe you're doing some mitigation already in a wildfire area and there is already a burn scar, the soil that is compromised, the vegetation is compromised, it's burned down, and I'm not a soil scientist, but it is burned down all the way to barren roots. So the soil is really compromised. When you're just removing vegetation and you're just trimming out trees, it doesn't have the compromising of the soil as much as we're going to have with a severe wildfire burn scar. So they can complement each other, but it is tricky. I'm going to say it is tricky. And again, I'm not a soil scientist, but there's lots of papers and research out there. Removing the trees and the vegetation right now, the vegetation is probably already removed due to the wildfire. Removing the trees to prevent and protect your home and property, that's going to lessen the impact of a wildfire.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Let's see, this next question from Tina is, it seems to be like in a specific situation. She asks, why does a wildfire skip one house and destroy another house? Like the same for a flood. Why does a flood skip one house and destroy another house? I guess she's asking about the difference in damage depending on the disaster.
Okay, I'll try this one.
Thanks,
So
Doug.
you're welcome, Sam, and thank you, Tina, for the question. We can chalk it up to the capriciousness of nature. Wildfires spread embers erratically, unpredictably. A structure may be better protected against wildfires through simple construction methods and materials. A standing seam steel roof will be more protection than a shake shingle roof for a structure. As far as flooding, waterways change. The dynamics of the flood waters can change the channel that it runs through. Debris can clog up a culvert or an overpass. That will change the dynamics of the flood water, where a structure that many people or the owner thought was out of the floodway suddenly becomes inundated with water from a backed up channel. Both wildfire and flooding are forces of nature, and anytime man has attempted to control forces of nature, nature has a way of surprising us, and it is very difficult to see a house standing that is abutted by 3 houses that were burned to the ground. It's disturbing, it's unfortunate, but that is the way of nature. Tina, I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
Thanks, Doug. This is another specific question for a situation and I know a lot of us in Colorado have this situation where we're driving in a car in a canyon. And Lisa asks, if you're caught in a car in a flash flood in a canyon road, would you have time to get out of the car and run up the hill? Or by the time you see water, is it too late to get out? So I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at this specific question of the best way to exit a vehicle during a flash flood.
This is Tracy, Lisa. It's a great question. It really is. Unfortunately, our panel probably doesn't have that expertise to direct you. I know personally myself, it'd be safer in the car is my personal thought, just with how much water it takes to move the car, as opposed to if you're a person that's walking and you get swept away, your feet are swept out from underneath you. But this would be a question I would probably put to maybe your fire chief would probably be the best person to ask this question. Would give you probably some great information.
Thanks, Tracy. And we have a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to get to them. And just to let everyone know, we are coming up soon on the hour, and we have a couple of slides to share with you on some resources after this. So we're going to attempt to answer these questions, but we may need to move on just out of respect for everyone's time on this webinar and to get to share these great resources with you. Next question is from Luke. Luke asks, there's still snow on the ground and on some of the burn scars. When might the likelihood of flooding start to increase this year? Next month or later this summer?
I'm going to ask Doug if the CWCB has any information on snowpack and what they might be looking at for spring runoff events. And I hate to put you on the spot, Doug. I'm not sure if they have any of that information or not.
No, that's all right, Tracy. Thank you. Severe flooding typically doesn't happen from snowmelt in the state. This year, we are below normal in almost all of our regions for snowpack. I think the highest we got is currently in the 80s, but I'll double check. The highest risk for flooding this year will be during the rainy season. So the monsoons, July, August through September, those are probably going to be the months where we will see, if we see flooding, those will be the months that we see. Again, snowpack can cause flooding. Typically, it's not as severe as the flooding we see during a rainfall event. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Doug. All right, our next question comes from Hal, and it's a great segue into, I think, our final slides here. Hal asks, what would be a good best first reference for individual preparedness groups and home fire-wise preparedness in FPA, ready.gov, etc.?
Want to take a stab at it, Doug?
No, you go ahead.
The best first reference. I don't know if I've got a best first reference for you, how I know a lot of those organizations will have some of the same information, just maybe worded a little bit differently. I don't think if you use one or the other, it's going to be detrimental. I think both of them are good resources for you. We're going to have some resources at the end of this presentation. The Colorado disaster website has some great resources for wildfire preparedness. We can send that information to you because I don't believe it's on this particular slide. But other than that, I couldn't tell you a best resource. Any preparation that you can do, all of these are going to be good resources for you to take a look at.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And that looks to be all of our questions that we had. So we are going to switch to the next slide. And here are some listed resources. I don't know if we want to, if Tracy, Peter, or Doug, if we want to highlight what these are and what folks can expect from these resources.
Sure, thanks, Sam. The first resource you see up there is the CWCB's website. We have a section on flood after fire. There will be links to federal and state resources from our site, as well as some informational fact sheets that you can read up on regarding flood after fire, how to prepare, how to mitigate, and where to find more information.
Thanks so much, Doug. All right, I think that is the end of our presentation. Please see the contacts here listed. These are the great folks that shared the information and answered all of those questions for us today. So thank you so much, Doug, Tracy, and Peter, for your help and your great information.
Thank you, Sam. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Okay, great, Doug. Thank you so much for participating with us.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you all. That is the conclusion of our Flood After Fire webinar. I do want to let you know that we have more fire and flood related webinars coming up. Today was our lunchtime session of Flood After Fire, but we have another lunchtime session coming up on wildfire preparation and recovery. And that will be at 12 noon Mountain Standard Time this Wednesday, April 14th. And you can sign up for that and register for that the same way you did for this presentation. And actually what I will do is I will put the registrations in the chat right now.
Sam, this is Doug. I wanted to bring to your attention Trish Gavelda with Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management with the state put a great comment in the chat about getting out of the way of floodwaters in a canyon. Would you like to read that?
Sure, I'm just seeing it. Yep, thanks so much. Yeah, she says 6 inches of water will reach the bottom of most passenger cars, causing loss of control and possible stalling. A foot of water will float many vehicles. 2 feet of water, of rushing water, can carry most vehicles, including SUVs and pickups. So that kind of gives you an indication of what just 6 inches, 1 foot, or 2 foot of water. The great lesson here is turn around, don't drown, from the National Weather Service. And Trish also says, better wet than dead. Climb to safety in case of a flash flood. Turn around, don't drown. Yes, that's something that I know is very useful and can be very timely here in the state of Colorado. All right, that concludes our webinar. And if you do want to sign up for one of our future webinars, either a lunchtime session or we have a couple evening sessions for the flood after fire, what you saw today, and the wildfire preparation and recovery next week. So I put the registration links in the chat right there if you do want to join us for another one. And thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and hope that you learned something new and were better informed. We will be responding to folks that registered with some more information on this presentation and the resources that were shared. So again, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Hope everyone learned something new. Stay safe. And this is the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.